And I'm going to talk about complexity and complex systems and ways that we can think about modeling from nature to inspire how we think about DAOs and organizations. So really good timing, because we just had two really cool talks talking about incentives, coordination of lots of different distributed resources. And so today I'm going to go into some ways that we can start thinking about modeling in that way. A little about me. My name is Christian. I co-founded a DAO called Diamond DAO. We're focused on building out a curated knowledge graph to help people find interesting frontier communities across this space. But when we think about systems, I always go back to nature, which is the ultimate sort of distributed, decentralized system that we can only really begin to imagine. How does everything come together, right? So we think about cells, starting at the kind of most individual basic level. Cells are sitting there processing information, coordinating with each other, and yet kind of emerge up as a complex system into ourselves, and here we are. Going then beyond ourselves, we think about just beyond the organism. We can think about organisms coming together and building flocks, right? So here's some amazing photographs from a photographer who takes time series of birds flocking together. And we can see that there's like some sense of order that's going on here, but there's no one individual who's in control, right? There's no boss saying, hey, birds, go this way. They're all kind of flying around. And I think like this is a really nice analogy to think about DAOs, right? Or at least in our sort of purest form of decentralization. Who's the boss? How do they come together? Well, there's definitely structure and order there, but like, how do we find it? And the answer there, right? So how do we go from sort of organization to simulation and understand kind of as a computer, how can we test our intuitions through models, right? And the answer there, the approach that's used to understand nature are agent-based models, right? So an agent is one individual, and we can find with very simple rules organized in the right way, we can create amazing and sort of emergent behavior. So what you're seeing in the background there is a simulation of birds flocking together. And there's only 3 parameters to this model, right? So it's not millions of data points that's needed. We don't need to go out there and study like how birds migrate across every different ecosystem. With just 3 sort of parameters tuned the right way and creatively applied to the system, we can start to generate behavior that looks real and get an intuition about what's going on with each individual agent here. So from there I take it and I think, what can we apply then about our human organizations, right? Like what are the simple rules and behaviors that sort of govern how we interact, right? So we saw in like earlier presentation, there's like thousands of people in a Discord. There's like lots of governance going on. There's people making choices. We're part of these systems, but we only have like very limited knowledge about what each other is thinking, each other's motivations, biases, perspective, all of these things that we bring to the organization. Can we start to think about maybe applying simple rules to get some intuition about what's actually going on? Right? So the framework to think about, if you're interested in applying this kind of mental model to your organization, is think, what's the micro, what's the macro? What's the interaction both within that level and then across levels, right? So agents, right? These might be members of our DAO. Well, how do we actually interact? Like what information specifically are we sharing with each other, right? And when we interpret that information from each other, what does that do to our own perspective, right? So we think we can simulate over time, like we saw with the birds in the prior slide. Instead, we're going to be simulating what happens to group behaviors over time, right? So what choices are being made at each step, right? How can we kind of formalize that with the model? What knowledge do we have about each other? when we're making these, right? These are all computer choices, right? So it's about being sort of creative and applying perspective to what's going on and then formalizing it into some sort of model to think like, what happens if I play this incentive out for 10 years? What's going to actually happen to my organization if things play out the way that I organized it, right? And then each agent, right, interacts with the environment, right? So our environment, we kind of decide what that is, right? In the DAO, that's kind of the organization, right? Like that's the treasury, for example. That's the network structure that's underlying, right? So there's simple rules that individual agents are making, and then that's affecting the environment, which then creates a feedback loop back to the individuals, and then it carries on, and we have this like complex dynamic system going on. Right, so if you want to get started, and you want to use this kind of modeling, you don't need to be quantitative to do this, and this is what I like about agent-based models, is you just have to have perspective, intuition about what's going on, right? So you start by naming the parts, right? So Diamond DAO, like I mentioned, we're on DAO House. We use the Moloch DAO framework. And what are the parts, right, of this model that I'm going to show you the results of in a second? Well, one, there's agents. Those are DAO members. So choice I made in this simple model for this presentation, everybody's got the same number of shares. Right? There's a proposal. And I was thinking about proposals and like, what does a proposal actually mean? It means that you're like accepting something that's then delivering value back into the DAO in some way. There's like kind of a couple dimensions, right? So a proposal happens, it could be like an engineering innovation is one dimension, and right, there's some value it's going to add in that sense. There's maybe like really cool community good vibes that's going to happen, right? So maybe that's another dimension, right? So in this model, I chose like 3 dimensions of value that a proposal will have. And then the environment, small world network. So like people at this conference, you probably have met people that you didn't know you had a common connection. You're like, wow, that's such a small world. There's actually a formal way. There's a model, there's a network model we can use to generate that same sort of small world connection, 6 degrees of separation type of phenomenon. And then there's like time and randomness. It's like what's random in the model. So for the one that I built here, what's random is in this consensus building period when voting is open, like who do you talk to like share perspective on how valuable you think this proposal actually is, right? So it's random. There's randomness going on there. And then time, each time step is 1 day. And so kind of some like simple results, but to kind of generate how to think about like what's going on is I said, well, what happens if I simulate this like a whole bunch of times, but then I increase the number of people in the DAO, but I keep their kind of close network relatively the same. So like each DAO member maybe has like 3 close friends that they do this, checking of like consensus building with of what's the value of this proposal. And each agent's got like this threshold. If they think it's valuable beyond this threshold, they're going to vote yes. If not, they're going to vote no. And what I want to understand is like, if I increase the size of this DAO, what does that do to like whether proposals pass or not? And so it's kind of interesting. I had no idea what I was going to see when I ran this, but I found that like up to 20 members, all of a sudden we kind of crater into this like almost nothing's getting passed. So it's like, well, that's kind of interesting, right? You start with this like small group, everybody's relatively aligned, it starts to grow, you go through this like trough of like consensus building, it's really hard. You get through that, and then all of a sudden like consensus is easier reached again. That kind of like mirrors experience in my own like life in this space of like seeing what happens as the community scales. There's usually like this kind of like hard period where it's like medium size and people are forming. So I thought this result was kind of interesting. Then for the second example, I said, okay, what happens if we start with like a really big community, and then instead of like changing how big that community is, change like how many close connections each member of the DAO is going to have, right? So start with like just 2 close friends, who you build consensus with, and you said, hey, this proposal's worth passing, it's really valuable for XYZ reasons. Well, what happens if you start taking more and more perspectives from more and more people as you're trying to get a vote passed, or a proposal passed? And I saw that, like, this was, I think, for like a 30-member DAO. Once you get, again, at like 8 connections, all of a sudden, like, consensus craters for whatever reason. I don't know why, right? So this is the thing. It's about identifying structure. It's about identifying pattern. I don't exactly know why this happens. And then beyond that, if you start to like broaden out your group who you build consensus with, all of a sudden, it's easier reached. Kind of interesting, right? Kind of maybe you can think of like experiences in your own DAO that might kind of relate, or maybe not, and you've got a different perspective on kind of what model should be used. So if you're really into the code and you really want to like explore this, then you can go. This is on GitHub, so check it out. Take a picture, star it, fork it, play around, right? This is very simple, but I'd love to see new perspectives in how to build this out and make it maybe more realistic. Cool ideas. I'll just seed some ideas into the crowd and see where this goes. You could refactor the code. So Block Science is a really cool package called CAD for agent-based modeling and complex adaptive systems. I didn't use that because I'm not that familiar with it yet. Moloch v3 is coming out. Has all kinds of new rules and all sorts of new incentives. Maybe you could make an agent-based model to see what those new rules can do to your community. You could like simulate and visualize it and make it like more compelling. And then if you're qualitative, you're like, I'm not really a coder, but I really like being in the DAO space, and this is fascinating. Again, you could, for example, maybe you can create a survey. When I was talking about like the value of these different dimensions of a proposal, maybe you could come up with a system to like map those to real numbers, and then we could see like, does their simulation match reality? Or you could create a whole new story altogether, right? I just came up with a story of people coming together in a small world, building consensus. They have a threshold, and then if it passes the threshold, then they vote yes. That's a story. I made that up. You can make up your own story, figure out a way, or connect with somebody who likes to code, put that together, and see, where does my intuition take me? So, thank you all for this extremely quick talk into agent-based models, complex systems. Follow me on Twitter. I'd love to see people with ideas. I love complexity. Doing a PhD in this, it's like, fascinating for me to talk about this. So always welcome. And I think we've got
we have 5
minutes
minutes for a couple of questions.